Most people think they understand how the global economy works: supply and demand, interest rates, inflation, and the usual buzzwords repeated in the news. But what if the world you think you live in is only the surface layer of a far more complex system? A system designed, shaped, and quietly manipulated by a handful of institutions whose decisions ripple across the planet, changing your daily life long before you ever hear about them. And what if one of the biggest secrets of this system isn't what happened, but why it keeps happening again and again? For decades, banks and governments have presented the economy as an organic machine, something that simply reacts to markets, trends, or global events. But the deeper you look, the more you realize that many of these reactions were predictable, engineered, or deliberately ignored until it was already too late. There's a reason the same crises repeat themselves in slightly different forms, and it's not because of coincidence or bad luck. To understand how this hidden architecture formed, we need to rewind more than a century. Imagine the early 1900s, not the world of smartphones and digital currencies, but a world where national economies were isolated, currencies were backed by gold, and financial powerhouses were just starting to discover how influence could cross borders. This is the world where the first seeds of today's global economic system were planted. At that time, nations wanted growth, corporations wanted expansion, and banks wanted control. Yet none of them had the coordinated system needed to stabilize international trade or protect themselves from sudden collapses. That vacuum created the perfect opportunity for a new financial order to emerge, one that would shape the next century of global decisions. It started with central banks, institutions that most people barely notice but which quietly determine the value of your money. The creation of the Federal Reserve in the United States in 1913 was a turning point. For the first time, a group of unelected bankers had the authority to expand or shrink the money supply, influencing interest rates and controlling liquidity in ways the public didn't fully understand. Other countries soon followed, building similar institutions with enormous power and minimal transparency. The world economy continued to evolve through conflict and necessity. After World War I, nations found themselves drowning in debt, currencies collapsing under hyperinflation, and governments desperate for stability. This led to the rise of international cooperation, but not necessarily in ways that benefited ordinary people. Private banking interests, political elites, and industrial titans saw an opportunity to shape the future. The Great Depression in 1929 exposed the fragility of the global financial machine. Banks failed, markets crashed, and millions were thrown into poverty. But behind the scenes, powerful institutions realized something crucial. Chaos creates openings. With economies collapsing, countries were willing to accept large-scale financial restructuring that would have been unthinkable before. After World War II, the world needed rebuilding. This crisis paved the way for the creation of institutions that still dominate global economics: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Bretton Woods system. These institutions promised stability, but they also centralized power. They controlled currency exchange rates, dictated economic policies to struggling nations, and created rules that often favored wealthy countries at the expense of developing ones. Bretton Woods tied currencies to the US dollar, and the dollar to gold, giving the United States enormous global influence. For years, this system seemed stable, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Countries began realizing that America was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. Confidence faded, tension grew, and in 1971, Nixon shocked the world by ending the gold standard. With a single announcement, money became a concept rather than a physical asset, value backed not by metal, but by trust. This shift changed everything. Once money was no longer anchored to gold, governments and banks could create currency on an unprecedented scale. Debt exploded, global trade accelerated, and financial markets became more profitable and more dangerous than ever before. The world entered the age of financialization, where money itself became the most traded commodity. Through the 1980s and 1990s, deregulation swept across the world. Banks gained even more freedom. International investment soared, and global institutions encouraged developing countries to open their markets. What they didn't mention was that these policies also made countries extremely vulnerable to foreign capital, currency attacks, and uncontrollable debt cycles. Then came the tipping points. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis shattered economies across Southeast Asia in a matter of months. Currencies collapsed, companies went bankrupt, and millions lost their jobs. Many nations accused hedge funds, speculators, and international institutions of making decisions that benefited the wealthy while destroying local economies. But the world moved on, unaware that this pattern would soon repeat. In the early 2000s, cheap credit, artificially low interest rates, and poorly regulated financial products created a global bubble. Banks were lending recklessly. Governments ignored the warning signs, and rating agencies gave high-risk assets the highest safety grades. When the truth finally surfaced in 2008, the world plunged into one of the worst financial crises in modern history. The fallout was devastating. Trillions of dollars evaporated, millions of homes were lost, and entire nations went bankrupt. And yet, the biggest banks, the same ones responsible for the collapse, were rescued with public money. Governments insisted it was necessary to save the economy. But for many people, it felt like the system was protecting itself at the expense of everyone else. That crisis revealed a truth few were willing to admit. Some institutions are considered too big to fail, too powerful to question, and too interconnected to hold fully accountable. While ordinary citizens suffered unemployment and austerity, global banks not only survived, they grew even larger. Attempts at reform followed, but they were often superficial. Regulations tightened and then loosened again. Promises of transparency faded under pressure from lobbyists. Instead of reducing risk, markets became more complex, with even larger pools of capital controlled by fewer institutions. The system didn't just recover, it evolved into something bigger, faster, and even more interconnected than before. Meanwhile, governments around the world embraced record levels of debt. Today, global debt has surpassed $300 trillion, an amount so large it's almost impossible to imagine. For perspective, that's over $37,000 for every person on Earth, including infants. But instead of addressing the root cause, governments continue borrowing more, hoping growth will eventually catch up. This growing debt burden is tied to one of the biggest secrets in modern economics. Inflation benefits those who hold assets, not those who hold wages. When prices rise, the wealthy see their investments grow, while ordinary people watch their cost of living increase faster than their income. It's a quiet transfer of wealth, hidden behind complex data and technical explanations. At the same time, central banks now play an even more dominant role. With a few announcements, they can cause stock markets to surge or crash, influence exchange rates, or determine the cost of borrowing around the world. Yet most of their meetings happen behind closed doors, with decisions communicated only after they're finalized. The pandemic brought this hidden machinery into the spotlight. Governments printed trillions of dollars to keep economies afloat, central banks slashed interest rates to near zero, and financial markets soared while real-world businesses struggled. It was a moment when many people realized that money could be created out of thin air, but the consequences would eventually surface. Those consequences came in the form of global inflation, the highest in decades. Prices of food commodities, housing, and energy skyrocketed. While governments blamed external factors, the reality was far more complicated. Years of easy money, supply chain weaknesses, and massive government spending had created the conditions for a worldwide cost-of-living crisis. Now, we're entering a new era of geopolitical tension, currency competition, and economic uncertainty. Nations are diversifying away from the US dollar. Digital currencies are challenging traditional banking, and global supply chains are being Yet through it all, the same patterns keep reappearing. Cycles of expansion and collapse, secrecy and exposure, crisis and intervention. If you look closely, the past and present mirror each other. The same institutions that shaped the economy 100 years ago still dominate today. The same mechanisms that triggered past crises are still in place, and the same groups who benefited from previous collapses continue to grow more powerful. But here is the part most people never learn. Global economies don't collapse because of a single failure. they collapse because small imbalances ignored or then snowball into global consequences. A policy decision in one country affects interest rates in another. A sudden shift in currency markets can collapse entire industries. A quiet change in banking regulation can set the stage for the next crisis. And while governments reassure the public that everything is under control, the truth is far more complex. Economic systems are fragile, deeply interconnected, and heavily influenced by institutions that often operate outside public view. The mysteries of global economics aren't about secret conspiracies, they're about understanding incentives, history, and the power of decisions that ordinary people never get to vote on. As we look ahead, 3 major lessons become clear. First, economic stability isn't guaranteed. It's engineered by institutions whose goals may not align with the public's interests. Second, the patterns of the past bubbles, crashes, debt cycles will continue unless real structural changes occur. And third, the future will belong to those who understand how money, power, and policy intersect on a global scale. The next decade will test the foundations of the global economic system. Whether we face prosperity or collapse depends on choices being made right now, choices that will reshape nations, redefine wealth, and determine the balance of power for generations. And as these changes unfold, staying informed is no longer optional. It's essential. If you found this breakdown eye-opening and want to explore more of the hidden forces shaping our world, consider subscribing. The more you understand the system, the better prepared you'll be for whatever comes next.